Good evening and welcome to Chicago Tonight on this Wednesday, February 6th.
If I'm being honest, I don't get paid what I'm worth. You know, I don't get the amount of money for the amount of work that I do.
Workers paid the minimum wage are poised to see bigger paychecks in Illinois. The head of Chicago's police watchdog agency weighs in on the federal consent decree.
You weren't supposed to do that.
A look at political messaging in the age of deeply partisan politics. More stories of aldermen potentially behaving badly dominate our discussion in this week's Spotlight Politics.
We're not saying it's a perfect solution, but it's definitely a solution for us.
Why the owners of one local restaurant are adding a special surcharge to the menu. And most Chicago area expressways are littered with billboards, but one expressway avoided that. Jeffrey Baer tells us why. All that and more next on Chicago Tonight. Thanks for joining us. I'm Phil Ponce. More pollution problems for a suburban company. Paris Schutz has that story and more. What's making news in Chicago tonight? Paris.
Phil, growing calls for a suburban Chicago plant that emits carcinogenic gas to shut down today. Illinois House Minority Leader Republican Jim Durkin today called on Willowbrook-based Sterigenics, and that's a company that sterilizes medical instruments, to immediately shut its doors and move out of town. This after a recent U.S. EPA study found that the company was still emitting dangerous levels of ethylene oxide, a gas linked to cancer. Illinois Attorney General Kwame Raoul and DuPage County State's Attorney Robert Berlin say they will exercise all legal authority to protect the community from exposure, but it's unclear whether or not they can force it to stop. Now, the company released a statement yesterday saying that it was premature to draw conclusions about long-term health risks from the EPA data. Day 2 of a walkout featuring teachers at 4 city charter schools. The teachers, represented by the Chicago Teachers Union, are protesting pay levels and class sizes at the Chicago International Charter Schools. The CTU says it has been bargaining with a school operator on a new contract since last spring. Now, the schools are staying open right now with reduced staffing. Teachers also walked out yesterday.
This is a problem, and it is a problem that they have every ability to solve today.
Phil, a group of suburban mayors are calling for help with their town's beleaguered pension funds. The Illinois Municipal League today put out a recommendation to state lawmakers to consolidate municipal pensions into one single larger fund to help with investments and cut administrative costs. The mayors involved include those from the towns of Peoria, Naperville, Barrington, and Palos Hills. They say the current system forces them to choose between funding basic public services and funding pension obligations. Several bills have been introduced in the Illinois General Assembly addressing these concerns. As for the weather, rain and possibly thunderstorms tonight with a patchy fog and a low around 33. Then rainy tomorrow and breezy with a high near 47. And don't forget, you can get Chicago Tonight streamed on Facebook, YouTube, and our website, WTTW.com/news. And you can also watch via podcast on the PBS video app. And Phil, back to you.
Thanks, Paris. The Illinois legislature is just starting its work for the year, but Democrats aren't waiting to use their new muscle in Springfield. Chicago Tonight's Amanda Vinicky is here to report on a measure that appears to be on the fast track, a measure to raise the minimum wage. Amanda, what's going on?
Well, Phil, J.B. Pritzker hasn't been in office a month yet, but his team is working hard to get him an early victory and allow him to deliver on a campaign promise to raise Illinois' minimum wage to $15 an hour.
So is this a done deal?
Not yet. Actually, the Senate had a committee meeting about the issue. There it is. You know that Democrats now control all of state government. They certainly have the ability to muscle it through, and it appears they will. That Senate committee advanced a plan today. It's expected to pass the chamber tomorrow. The vote could be trickier in the House, but Democrats do hold a super majority there too, and House Speaker Michael Madigan has signaled he will back the plan. That would be a victory for Aisha Cross, a personal assistant with the Department of Rehabilitation Services. She feeds, bathes, and otherwise cares for her sister, who suffers from a debilitating disease and can't take care of herself. Per her contract as a member of SEIU Healthcare, Cross makes $13 an hour. That's more than the minimum wage, but she says she struggles at that.
I live in the city of Chicago, so that's not even enough to live off of. You know, I'm constantly living check to check. I am constantly living with a negative balance in my bank account because I sacrifice everything to give it to my sister. So, you know, what do I make? I don't make enough. I don't make enough.
But there are a lot of business owners sweating hard about the prospect of seeing their payroll prices spike.
What it's going to mean for businesses, what's going to be for small businesses, especially in central and southern Illinois, it's going to be extremely difficult. I mean, you know, a lot of them are trying to figure out how to keep their doors open. There's been a lot of talk about how the economy is booming, and in many parts of the state, it is. But I think that in central and southern Illinois, they're going to tell you a different story.
So what is it that retailers are looking for?
They want a regional exemption, or at least some sort of consideration for that anyway. They say there should be either a slower phase-in of the minimum wage in places outside of the Chicago area or a lower wage. Couple reasons there. First, because of the economic pain that downstate is in. Also, the minimum wage in Chicago is already higher than the statewide minimum wage, so bringing it up will be a huge leap for those businesses.
If you're going to go to 15 eventually, that it should you should get there in different parts of the state at different times. Or does it really make sense to go to 15 in southern Illinois where they're really struggling with economic activity there and the loss of jobs?
It may cost a little less to live outside of the city, but that doesn't mean that their work is less. You know, if you're doing the same work I'm doing, why should I get paid more? Because I sometimes may choose to live in a place that costs more to live in.
So what exactly is the proposal? How much would the minimum wage go up?
Remember, in Chicago, it is currently $12 an hour and will rise to $13 an hour come July, but the statewide minimum wage right now is $8.25. Under the proposal just unveiled this afternoon, it'll remain there this calendar year, but then come some quick ramp-ups such that it'll increase 3 times from 2020 to 2021, and then go up by $1 a year until it reaches $15 in 2025. The measure does aim to help small businesses, some by offering a tax credit they can claim, but retailers say only 2% of businesses will be able to do so.
That's not a lot. That means that 98% of businesses won't be able to take advantage of that credit. So it's a nice talking point, but in fact, not a lot of folks will be able to take advantage of it.
There is, of course, a flip side of that projected economic impact.
Big companies, of course, they can afford it. They're not going to sit there and tell you they can't because they know they can. And small businesses, once the consumers see a hike in our wages, we can then contribute to their business and keep them afloat. Not even keep them afloat, but continue and allow them to be prosperous because we are now making more so we can now spend more.
So why the rush to get this done?
Well, Pritzker won the governor's race with union backing, and this shows why labor chose to get behind him. This is something that unions very much want to occur, and especially because Pritzker may soon have to disappoint them. He'll be delivering his budget address in a couple of weeks, and given Illinois' financial situation, it's expected he'll have to deliver a whole lot of pain that unions aren't going to necessarily appreciate. This may head off some of that. Now, mind you, Phil, that park districts, schools, state government itself will have to pay, of course, this increased minimum wage, so it's going to cost them, too.
Amanda, thank you. And now to Carol Marine and the head of Chicago's police watchdog agency. Carol.
Phil, thank you. There's been a lot of talk of police reform in Chicago since the camera captured the police killing of a 17-year-old named Laquan McDonald. The Independent Police Review Authority was deemed inadequate and ineffective, so in its place emerged a new police watchdog agency with more funding and more staff, the Civilian Office of Police Accountability, or COPA. Advocates for reform hope COPA and a recently approved federal consent decree will usher in more accountability to the police force. But will it? Joining us is the head of the Civilian Office of Police Accountability, Sydney Roberts. Thanks for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
So, before there was IPRA, there was OPS. OPS had to be abolished. IPRA had to be abolished. Today with COPA, I'm wondering what sort of metric can you suggest to citizens who are trying to judge for themselves if COPA is going to be any better than its predecessors?
Yes, thank you, and I think that's an excellent question. I think one of the metrics is how responsive, how engaging, and how much does COPA interact with the community. One of the big criticisms of IPRA and OPS was that the agency itself did not engage the community enough. And one of the things that we have been doing is being very robust and proactive in our community engagement efforts. For instance, one of the things that we do is following an officer-involved shooting, we immediately reach out to the family and explain to them what we're going to do, what our investigation looks like, what they can expect from us. We walk them through that investigative process. We speak with them in advance of the release of a officer-involved shooting video. But we also, and we did this in the, when Mr. Augustus was shot and killed, we reached out to the South Shore community stakeholders and sat down with them and talked to them, answered their questions. And so not only did we have the ability to inform and educate, but we also had the ability to be educated by. And I think that's one key measure that demonstrates our ability to follow through, because it places the community in a position to hold us accountable to what we said we were going to do.
You have a staff of about 140.
Yes.
How many of them came over from IPRA to COPA?
Yes, we're about 25 to 30 people that remained from IPRA, but each person that, if they remained or came on, they were still subject to a very rigorous interview process. They had to successfully complete COPA Academy. And the staff that we have, both the IPRA staff that was retained, as well as the staff that has come on since COPA, I mean, I'm very pleased with the staff. I think we have an excellent staff.
So the troubled past of IPRA included the fact that hardly any complaints of officers behaving improperly were sustained. Under COPA so far, what's the percentage of sustained complaints?
We are, let me say this, okay, because we're in the middle of finalizing our annual report, and I don't want to misquote, but I can tell you that our sustained cases have increased than from last year. And from the prior years. I don't have that actual number.
Or a percentage?
Offhand. I don't have a percentage offhand. I want to say it's in the area of 15 to 20%, but it has been, it has enhanced since that time period.
Recently, one of your investigators was charged criminally for making false threats against a fellow employee, and yet that investigator is still on the payroll for the city. Why is that?
Yes, under the city's policy, when an employee is subject to discipline, until the full administrative process is done, the employee is afforded an element of due process, and the employee is eligible to a hearing within the Department of Law, and so it's just going through the process. There's a, you know, they're represented by a collective bargaining agreement, and certain checks and balances have to occur before that person.
Is she still an investigator? Is she still doing work?
Oh, absolutely not.
So she's on administrative leave of some
Yes, she is on
sort.
administrative leave and was on administrative leave very shortly after that incident.
This investigator actually was hired by COPA, wasn't an IPRA carryover, but she's a sibling of a Chicago police officer in a relationship with a Chicago police officer. Did COPA do appropriate vetting of this particular investigator?
Yes, I believe that we have a very robust hiring process where we look at people's backgrounds to make sure that they are suited for the job. Secondly, when an individual starts working with COPA, they have to sign a conflict of interest that they will inform us if there is a conflict, that they will not engage in any practices or behaviors that would compromise the integrity of the office or themselves. That the employee did not do what they were supposed to do.
So she did not reveal those relationships?
Yes, not appropriate to this particular instant, but the process is a sound process.
You came on board, what, about 8 months ago?
Yes.
You are the third head of COPA in 2 years. That must feel tremendously challenging.
It is. And I want to get this out. You know, when I was interviewing for the position, I realized that I truly believed that this was a job that was meant for me. I believe that my background brought me to this position. But I have to admit that, you know, when I got here, you know, I hit here right in the beginning of budget season. I had to figure out what the budget for 2019 should be while I'm still figuring out, you know, what our investigative operations are. Had to figure out how to address enhancing our case closure capacity in the midst of getting ready to prepare for the consent decree. So I did have to hit the ground running, for sure.
Is the consent decree going to give you different and better tools to make police accountable if they need to be held accountable?
Absolutely. You know, one of the things that I like about the consent decree is that it is an actual roadmap to addressing holistically police reform, whether it's addressing training, whether it's addressing hiring. But from an accountability standpoint for COPA specifically, it actually has enhanced our investigative jurisdiction, sexual misconduct complaints, a better response to domestic violence incidents, as well as a development of a mediation program that will include input and guidance from the actual community.
Given the sort of disastrous histories of OPS and IPRA, is there oversight of you and COPA? Is there somebody who gets to look over your shoulder just to make sure that you're accountable?
Yes, absolutely. The Inspector General, the Deputy Inspector General for Public Safety, has the authority and exercises the authority to look at not only our operations, but our investigative work product. The police board is a level of oversight over what we do. The public is a level of oversight over what we do. And the Federal Monitor will have oversight of authority over what we do as well.
You've been asked about the Code of Silence because you've spent a significant part of your career in law enforcement as well as outside of law enforcement. And you've said that every profession has a Code of Silence, and yet a retail clerk versus the awesome power of a police officer with a weapon are not equal. Aren't police, in fact, much more accountable in this Code of Silence circumstance?
Yeah, and let me expound on that answer that I provided earlier. And I think the first thing that I want to make clear is that while my experience both within law enforcement, investigating internal affairs, and since my time at the Chicago Police Department, I have seen instances where officers have engaged in characteristics that are indicative of a Code of Silence. What I have not seen is that it is pervasive throughout the entire department. And I can say that because we as an agency receive complaints from police officers informing us of misconduct by other police officers. But to your point that you just raised, yes, the police officers are held to a higher standard, absolutely. But I didn't want anyone to leave thinking that a Code of Silence is only unique to a law enforcement profession.
There are those in the community who might argue that they believe it has been pervasive in the Chicago Police Department, and that is a strongly held belief, as you know, in communities.
Absolutely.
Is that part of your job too?
Part of my job is to respond to that, to address it, and if there is pervasive Code of Silence, COPA has the authority to investigate that.
Sydney Roberts, new head of the Civilian Office of Police Accountability. Thanks for being with us.
Thank you so much. I appreciate it.
There is more ahead on Chicago Tonight. Please stay with us.
Still to come on Chicago Tonight, why the owners of one local restaurant say adding a surcharge to checks is the best way to help their workers. Our political spotlight discussion centers on the mayor's race and more stories of aldermen perhaps behaving badly. And these towering goddess figures wound up a long way from home for 75 years. Where did they go? Jeffrey Bear has the story. But first, the season for political messaging is in hot swing. But how can politicians, especially in a huge field of mayoral or aldermanic candidates, break through with their messages? And in last night's State of the Union address, the pre-speech spin was on unity and bipartisanship, but what President Trump said was more of a mixed message.
An economic miracle is taking place in the United States, and the only thing that can stop it are foolish wars, politics, or ridiculous partisan investigations. If there is going to be peace and legislation, there cannot be war and investigation. It just doesn't work that way.
Here to talk about political messaging is Jason DeSanto. He's a senior lecturer at Northwestern University's Pritzker School of Law and has more than 15 years' experience as a political speechwriter for congressional and presidential campaigns. Jason, good to have you back.
Good to be here, Phil.
First of all, the theme was supposed to be nonpartisan, bipartisanship. At least that was the spin heading into it. That clip that we just saw, how did it measure up on those two counts?
Well, it didn't seem particularly bipartisan. It seemed, in fact, highly partisan, at least in that part of the speech. And let's be clear, it's completely appropriate to appeal to different audiences in different ways with different kinds of appeals, even ones that, if you laid them side by side, might not seem to go together very well. You can speak to different audiences with different sets of relevant facts, different appeals. Persuasion's not a zero-sum game. But if you're making an essential claim about something, in this case being bipartisan, and then you say something immediately inconsistent that goes along with that, then you're going to harm your credibility. It's a sheer question of hypocrisy, particularly if over the long haul you've been, even earlier that day, calling Joe Biden dumb, and in the past dividing people with statements about, during the campaign, Mexican rapists, or during the administration, the Charlottesville situation. So what we have here is a basic problem of a loss of credibility on a key point and key issue.
Historically, the State of the Union address doesn't necessarily move approval ratings very much. According to ABC's political site 538, it just doesn't move the needle very much. So who is the president speaking to?
Well, over the past few years, what we've seen is most of the time, the larger part of the audience is supporters. They're members of the president's party or supporters of the president. That was true for President Obama. It's true for President Trump. Last night, the numbers showed that 25% of the people in the country identify themselves as Republican, 25%, and yet last night about 42% of the viewers identified themselves as Republican, so about a 17-point spread. So in that way, we would expect relatively high approval ratings for the speech, and that's what it got. That flash poll from CBS showed about 76% of the people liked what they heard, either a lot or at least somewhat.
Well, messaging has been going on a number of issues, and one of them had to do with the recent federal shutdown. And let's take a look at the messages from both sides of the shutdown.
Republicans and Democrats must join forces again to confront an urgent national crisis. Congress has 10 days left to pass a bill that will fund our government, protect our homeland, and secure our very dangerous southern border.
Just a few weeks ago, I joined volunteers to distribute meals to furloughed federal workers. They waited in line for a box of food and a sliver of hope since they hadn't received paychecks in weeks. Making livelihoods of our federal workers a pawn for political games is a disgrace. The shutdown was a stunt engineered by the President of the United States.
Which of those messages was more effective in terms of delivering that nugget that people can hang on to?
Well, again, it's a little audience dependent, but I would say on balance the second one. And here's the reason why. Earlier, when we talked about the dissonance between bipartisanship and partisanship. We were talking about a fundamental of communication, which is credibility. Here's another fundamental. You have to take your audience where you find them. And if we think about the larger American spectrum of audience members right now, this is a matter that has to some extent been litigated with that audience. There are numbers on the shutdown, and the numbers indicate that most of the people, 54%, over 35%, blame Trump and the Republicans over the Democrats for the shutdown. 71% don't think that it makes sense to tie the building of a border wall to the shutdown. So this is a battle walking in where the administration has a very difficult road to hoe. I think we see that here. I mean, essentially, the president said very little about the shutdown, didn't say the word shutdown, and even in that clip we saw, he said something about opening the government, and that was it, kind of ran from it. Abrams, on the other hand, giving the response, went into more detail, cast it as a longer story to tell, where there were actually people being hurt, those were the workers, and actually talked about the fact that it was a choice, and a choice that the administration had made. So I think there is a situation where she recognized that there was an advantage. She took that advantage, kind of extended it out, and tried to deploy that to her advantage.
And on this theme of messaging, how did Nancy Pelosi and Chuck Schumer do in that regarding the shutdown in that Oval Office meeting with the president, where basically they branded it as the quote Trump shutdown?
They didn't say anything, is what they did. They stayed quiet and they let Trump walk right into it and basically say, I will claim responsibility for the shutdown. And in doing that, in stepping into that, he created his own framing. And there's an old adage, Phil, frame the debate and you win the debate. And in that case, they let Trump frame the debate, but in a way that actually boomeranged on him, so that there wasn't just the case that he had said he would own the shutdown, but there's video of it that could be played over and over again of him actually saying that. And the funny thing about that is, I think to him, that's consistent with his political brand. I'm coming in, I'm the outsider, I'm running against government, I'm going to govern against government. And yet, as Newt Gingrich learned in the 1990s, that doesn't always work out the way that you think it will during a government shutdown. The people actually tend to say after a while they'd like the government to be open, and that's what happened here as well.
And an enduring message that the president is making has to do with immigration, and let's take a look at what was said about that.
Now is the time for Congress to show the world that America is committed to ending illegal immigration and putting the ruthless coyotes, cartels, drug dealers, and human traffickers out of business. This is a moral issue.
We know bipartisanship could craft a 21st century immigration plan, but this administration chooses to cage children and tear families apart. Compassionate treatment at the border is not the same as open borders. President Reagan understood this. President Obama understood this. Americans understand this.
So one message focused on sort of a warning, and the other one had to do with compassion. What kind of messaging works best as between those two approaches?
You know, actually there's research about that and fear-based appeals versus appeals that are not fear-based appeals. And they show that fear-based appeals work, but if you go to the well too often, you're going to lose some degree of credibility. And again, we come back to that question. Again, where is the audience on this? America as a whole. 60%, according to a Gallup poll from a couple of days ago, say they don't want any more building of a wall, period. Now, that number can move, it can change, but again, that's kind of where audiences are. And we get back to the issue of credibility. The president's been making that same case for a long time. He made it in the State of the Union last year, 2018. He made it again a couple of weeks ago in a nationally televised address from the Oval Office on immigration. So we've heard those facts before. And after a while, if you start to lose a little bit of credibility, Phil, you don't just lose the argument, you lose the audience for your argument. You lose the ability for people to hear the argument, and they're not really hearing those facts anymore. Her vision was a little bit different, told a little bit more of a story, but also started to hit at some different values, not just compassion, but also the idea of bipartisanship. We had Obama and Reagan name-checked there, and then also the idea of what our future is going to look like, including family as a value as well. So those things worked well with that messaging.
Well, let's take a look at a moment last night that may have backfired a bit for the president.
No one has benefited more from our thriving economy than women who have filled 58% of the newly created jobs last year.
And did the speechwriters realize that this could be something that might have happened?
They might have thought there would be applause a couple of lines later when he was saying that more women were serving in Congress than ever before. They probably didn't realize exactly what was going to happen in the room with that unintended applause that ensued. And, you know, I think you have to anticipate that when you're writing the speech, although it's hard to do that because you sort of get in your own head about writing a speech and not anticipating all the dynamics. But Phil, that room, you know, the State of the Union address is not just constitutional. It's not just that there's a phrase in the Constitution that says the president should deliver information to the Congress. It's a ritual, and rituals are communicative. There's a communicative element to them, which means the president isn't the only person communicating. By the way, I thought last night Trump did a much better job of handling the ritualistic aspects of it, the spectacle of it, the dynamics of it. I thought he told stories better. I thought his delivery was better than it was a year ago. But the other point is there's plenty of other communication going on in that room, from the women deciding to wear the white dresses to people bringing guests. And right there, simply by standing up and essentially having a party. And they look like they're having a great time.
Jason, let's switch to the mayor's race for a second. There are 14 candidates. How does somebody get their message out when there are so many people in the field?
Good luck. But it's basically a combination of your message and mediums. And if you think about the mediums, you got all these different channels of communication that are available to you in any campaign, but particularly one like this that it's a sprint. You're going to use every one that you can, whether you can get yourself on television with paid media, that's going to take money. We've got mailers that end up in people's doors. We've got cell phone messages. The Vallis campaign got some criticism for doing a lot of that. And we've got door-to-door campaigning, among other ways. And then finally, debates. And debates are going to be important. Debates are a good way to segue over to the messaging, because your message is what's got to drive it. You've got to hit those platforms, but you need a message that quickly identifies who you are to a bunch of people who don't know you. Do it in 2 or 3 weeks' time, and do it in a way that distinguishes you from the other 12 or 13 people that are running. And in these debates, maybe now there have been 30, 40, 45 forums up to this point. Now we're getting to televised debates. And this is when things really can coalesce, and it's also when that messaging from all those forums has to have crystallized, so that whatever the news is of the day, you are the candidate that is seen as the most credible and the best, particularly in contrast to the other 4 or 5 people on that debate stage that night.
As they say, stay tuned. Jason DeSanto, thanks very much.
Thanks, Phil.
There is a new food trend that is happening across the country. No, it's not a new diet or type of food, but a surcharge that's added to customers' checks. A few Chicago restaurants are now trying it out, and here's a taste of what it is and why one local restaurant is doing it.
We added a 4% add-on to all of our bills.
Here at Logan Square's Fat Rice restaurant, there's a new item on the menu, a fair wage and wellness provision. That provision adds a surcharge to customers' checks. It's to help the owners accomplish 2 things, to help pay for their employees' health insurance and to lower wage disparities between front and back of house staff, which results from tipping.
This is a 4% charge on the bill that is a clear and transparent way of us raising prices and directing that money directly to our employees.
For example, if a meal comes out to be $100, the 4% provision will add $4 to the total. Chef Abe says those $4 go straight to employees' paychecks, especially kitchen staff like cooks and dishwashers.
The supplemental income has allowed us to increase back-of-the-house wages by around 25%. In addition, we're able to provide a co-pay health insurance to all of our full-time employees.
Fat Rice started adding the charge on January 1st. And even though employees are only 2 paychecks into the new year, 24-year-old grill cook Travis Champer says he sees a difference in his paycheck and in his life.
Having health care where I don't have to go through my parents, and I have a community of people that I see regularly that also have this health care, makes me feel more comfortable about seeking out help if I do have any health-related issues.
But not everybody's convinced. Restaurant chain consultant Bob Golden says he supports supplying health insurance for employees, but he worries customers will perceive the surcharge as another cost to an increasingly expensive restaurant experience.
I just think, there will be some who I think are comfortable enough that their consumers and their customers will value what they're doing. But I think by and large, I don't see it spreading very much. Eating out is expensive, especially when you factor in tax, tip, possibly parking. It's expensive to eat out. It's an inhibitor for many consumers, which is why some decide to have meals delivered or eat at home.
In its 6 years, Fat Rice has earned recognitions and awards for its global Portuguese fare with Asian and Indian flavors. But even as the hotspot continues racking up honors, chefs and co-owners Abe Conlon and Adrian Lowe say they've struggled finding ways to attract and retain talent. Chef Abe says that's not only a problem at Fat Rice, but at restaurants worldwide.
There are just fewer and fewer people that want to be cooks or that stay on as cooks. And if they do, generally they might be going to, as cost of living goes up, they naturally are going to be going to places that can pay higher prices.
Those places include hotel restaurants or large restaurant groups where profit margins run high. According to the Illinois Restaurant Association, independently run restaurants like Fat Rice have a profit margin between 3 and 5%. That leaves very little financial room to offer higher wages and health benefits.
A lot of people say, well, isn't it the employer's responsibility to provide health care or provide higher wages to their employees? And they're absolutely right. It is our responsibility, and that's the reason that we implemented this surcharge.
Despite mixed reaction on social media, Chef Abe says the in-person response from customers has been very positive.
I think a lot of people do understand that back of the house works hard, as hard as the front of the house, and that they need to get paid more, and that having access to health care is a good thing.
Chef Abe says he doesn't think the surcharge is the perfect solution, but he's hoping to perfect the recipe. The surcharge is not only at Fat Rice, but can be found at other Chicago hotspots like Giant and Daisy's. You can visit our website to find Fat Rice's open letter on its fair wage and wellness provision, and take a poll to voice your opinion. More aldermen caught up in some questionable or unscrupulous behavior this week as the campaign for mayor gets down and dirty. Our political team of Amanda Vinicky, Paris Schutz, and Carol Marine takes us behind the scenes once again in this week's edition of Spotlight Politics. Let's start out talking about Ed Burke, because this video came out of him, for all intents and purposes, electioneering at a polling place. Paris, ramifications of that?
He's not necessarily in any legal trouble or going to be arrested from this. I talked to Chicago election authorities. They said it was clearly a violation. Here he is during last November's general election, showing up at the polling place, handing out Ed Burke bags, and then apparently his workers are helping get petition signatures for Ed Burke's aldermanic race. And when election judges come and say, "Excuse me, Mr. Alderman, you can't do this," he says, "Who are you?" Tell him I disagree with that. There's nothing wrong with what I'm doing. So the Board of Elections sent an investigator there when they got a complaint. They asked him to leave. He did, and it was like whack-a-mole. He showed up in another precinct, did the same thing. Investigator asked him to leave, then another precinct, and another.
Who doesn't want an Alderman Burke bag, right?
You know, if he's not in legal trouble, he should be, but he's in optical trouble. And let's remember, this happened in November before the federal raid. So he doesn't know, we presume, that the feds are hot on his trail and about to hit his offices. But he looks like a joyless mafia don.
Fedora, trench coat.
Fedora, trench coat, handing them out, but handing them out kind of mechanically. and he's been an alderman for 50 years. He knows you don't do that in a polling place.
And that's part of, I think, the issue and why people are so frustrated with politics and these aldermen, because it's as if the rules don't apply. You said it right there. I mean, clearly people were saying, no, authorities saying, stop this behavior, it's not allowed. It's illegal.
Election
Don't
just
do
telling
it.
him to stop. Some of whom
And
he might have put in those jobs.
Continuing to do
Let's talk
it.
about
That's
the
what gets
14th
people's
Ward
goat.
race. Are any other candidates gaining traction on Ed Burke as far as anyone can tell?
You know, I have not seen any polling in that arena, but clearly you do have one of the candidates that is backed by Congressman Chuy Garcia, who in fact tried to really make an issue of this electioneering video. So that's clearly done to be helping his candidate.
The other candidate got both of the endorsements from the Sun-Times and the Tribune. Do those endorsements, how big a deal are they in aldermanic races?
There are some people who still carry them in, but here's the thing we talked about last week, and it's still true. So you got Jaime Guzman, who was Chuy Garcia's chief of staff. You've got Tanya Patino, who's endorsed by Chuy Garcia. You've got Ed Burke. Okay, a three-way race. And Ed Burke still, if those two take away votes from each other, Ed Burke can still walk through and win this thing.
Or they could make sure that he gets into a runoff, though, that he doesn't get 50% plus one.
Right, but never count the incumbent out in this circumstance, not even an incumbent who's got the feds on him.
His Instagram and Facebook game right now is hot. I mean, he's posting about the Puppy Bowl. He was posting about the Maroon 5, a halftime show. I mean, he's pretty
active on.
He or whoever is in charge of that account.
He's trying to
he's
anyway.
Trying to, yeah.
Let's switch wards. Let's go to the first ward with Alderman Joe Moreno. What's going on there? Can
Boy, we would all like to know.
give us some bullet points.
So bullet points are that there was a woman who evidently had dated and at some point lent his car to, but he says he tried to get it back and she did not return his phone calls. There are texts that appear to show, however, that their communication never really ceased. But when she had the car, he ultimately called the cops and reported it stolen. She therefore ended up in jail for driving around a stolen car. Again, the texts that she has shown to members of the media appear to seem like everything is fine, and he says that he'll straighten it out, but
So
it certainly could lead to legal
whether or not he
trouble
filed
for
a
him.
false police report.
And the police are looking at that right now, and the state's dropped the charges against the woman, and now there are ramifications in the mayor's race because he was about to have a fundraiser for Susana Mendoza on February 20th, and she's saying, well, I don't know anything about that. I'm not going to be there.
He himself has an aldermanic race, we should point out, so the ramifications could be legal for him, but it could also hurt his chances for re-election. And again, you have to say the Chicago City Council right now is not helping anybody's faith in good government.
And the reason this gets so interesting, I think, for people in the ward is these text messages, even though some of them are blacked out, seem to be somewhat steamy. So whatever was going on between her, him, the car, how long she kept it, I think it's like a telenovela in a way.
Well, let's talk about what's going on in the mayor's race directly, and that has to do with the forums. There have been a slew of them in the past couple of weeks. Carol, is anyone gaining traction? Anyone rising above the field as a result of these forums?
I really wish I knew. I mean, I think it depends if you were in the audience in Gage Park versus the one, in Little Village. I don't know. And part of it is that some of the younger candidates are hoping for a big millennial turnout and that civic engagement. You've got some regular names like Daley and Chico and Preckwinkle, and they have a base. I cannot honestly tell you that I have a decent answer on this, nor do I believe the polling that I've seen.
And guess what? Nearly nobody in Chicago has a decent answer because
so many moving parts.
The early voting numbers are extremely low. In 6 days of early voting, about 1,200 people have early voted according to the Chicago Elections Board. It's about 200 people a day. And that's including the days that's taking away the 2 days the polling place was closed. That means no one has made up their mind. And the Elections Board says it's pretty unusual to see this low a number at this point, meaning it could be a heavy rush on Election Day when people finally decide.
I'm going to wait to cast my ballot because with all of the news that keeps on coming at such this quick pace, I'd say hold off. There's plenty left to learn.
I'm in the eye doctor's office. I love my eye doctors. And one of them whistles me in and says, all right, just tell me. Just tell me out of the 14, who should I vote for?
Off the record, Carol, off the record.
And even if I could tell you, I can't tell you. It's too fluid, too crazy. And, you're just going to have to read everything you can read.
part of that fluidity reached to one of the candidates, and that's Amara Enya. She was hammered about questions on how she dealt with her personal finances. Paris, how did she do handling those?
Well, one of the things she did that was kind of interesting is saying, well, you know, a bunch of people with decent personal finances ran the city, and look what they did. The city isn't doing so well, so why don't you try someone whose personal finances are kind of a mess? I mean, there are unpaid student loans, there are, you know, I think it seems like false statements to the IRS where she didn't claim $20,000 in income
when it was
on her tax.
When it was a third of her income.
A third of her income, and then falsely claiming dependents on her tax return. This is not just oops, I forgot, or oops, I'm struggling to make ends meet. This is conscious behavior right now. But it was kind of funny. She said, well, you know, Rahm's finances were pretty good, and he didn't do so well, so why don't you elect someone who doesn't have good finances?
And there are questions in her employment as a city manager in University Park, questions of whether she was telecommuting and therefore not in the office, whether it's a very financially strapped suburb, asking for more than a six-figure salary. So it was a tricky week for her.
As we said, a lot of moving parts in this mayor's race. Amanda, Paris, Carol, thank you all.
You're welcome.
And be sure to check out our Voter's Guide to the Chicago election, where you can learn more about the field of mayoral hopefuls, as well as the candidates for alderman, clerk, and treasurer. You can also check your voter registration status, as well as find locations where you can early vote. That is at WTTW.com/votersguide. And after the break, an encore edition of Ask Jeffrey.
Don't miss one of our stories. Get them all delivered to your desktop or mobile device with a subscription to the WTTW News Daily Briefing. Go to WTTW.com/daily briefing and sign up.
As you may know, drivers along interstates like the Stevenson and the Jane Addams Tollway are bombarded with billboards, while one expressway remains an ad-free paradise. You might even call it an Eden. So how did the expressway through the North Shore suburbs get so lucky? Jeffrey Baird drives by with the answer to that and other viewer questions in tonight's edition of Ask Jeffrey. Hi, Jeffrey.
Hi, Phil.
You look very dapper tonight, by the way.
Thank you.
And so let's get to that question about billboards. How does the Eden's Expressway stay free of billboards? Who is that inquisitor?
I posed a question to myself. Every now and then I ask myself a question because I'm curious about something that I spot out in the world, and I've often wondered this. Why do other Chicago area interstates have all these billboards, but you don't see them along the Edens? So, you know, as a point of comparison, take a look at this. Here's the Stevenson choked with billboards. Same thing on the Jane Addams, past O'Hare, the Dan Ryan, and so forth. And here is the Edens. As you said, an Eden, free of billboards. The short answer we found out is that there is actually a state law prohibiting billboards except in business and industrial areas. The law is called the Highway Advertising Control Act of 1971, and since most of the Edens passes through residential areas and forest preserves, billboards are not permitted. But even in commercial areas of those North Shore communities, local zoning laws forbid billboards. The battle against billboards goes back to the early days of auto travel with organizations like the Garden Club of America, and at the vanguard of this battle were women. Way back in 1933, the Chicago Tribune carried this article about a national meeting of the Garden Club at Chicago's Drake Hotel, at which the state delegations reported on a lot of progress combating, quote, the billboard nuisance and disfigurement of natural beauty. 2 decades later, in 1952, the chairwoman of the Garden Club of Illinois' Superhighway Beautification Committee reported, quote, Cook County and all villages along the Edens Parkway, as it was called back then, agreed to zone against commercial placards on this new route between Chicago and Lake County.
And I assume they were not as successful regarding the other highways around Chicago.
Definitely not, as anyone who's traveled on those highways could tell you. The club had hoped that communities along the highways that we now know as the Eisenhower, the Stevenson, and the Tri-State Expressway would pass similar restrictions, but no, they did not have the same success. The 1971 state law actually was not so one-sided in its view of billboards as the Garden Club was. It sought to protect the beauty of expressways, yes, but also acknowledged the legitimate need of businesses to advertise, and since much of the land along Chicago's other expressways is zoned as business, billboards there are permitted.
Well, that answers that. Our next question comes from Downers Grove. As a volunteer at the Downers Grove Museum, I came across a 1980s photo of DuPage County workers moving a statue, one of two, from the Cutton House to Donata Forest Preserve. Later, they were moved back to the Board of Trade where they started. Who was Mr. Cutton, and how did he happen to have the statues in the first place?
You know, Phil, you'd think it would be hard to lose two 5-ton statues, but it actually did happen.
I misplaced one the other day.
Just the other day. As our viewer said, the two 12-foot granite goddess figures representing industry and agriculture now reside in a plaza near the Chicago Board of Trade. This is on Jackson Street. Originally, though, they guarded the entrance of Chicago's very first Board of Trade, which was built in 1885. That old building was designed by W.W. Boyington, the same architect who did the water tower. It had the tallest tower in Chicago, but it was so poorly built. Look at this next picture. They actually ended up lopping off the tower, and then they just gave up and tore down the whole building. It was replaced by the Board of Trade that we all know today at the foot of LaSalle Street. And at the time, there just wasn't much sentiment for preservation. But a fellow named Arthur Cutton, a wealthy grain trader who was known as the Corn King, was an exception to that. Cutton salvaged two stained glass windows from the building and the two statues we're talking about. And he brought them as mementos to his country home, which was called Sunny Acre Farm in Downers Grove.
So how did they get back to the CBOT?
Okay, so Cutton died in 1936, and shortly after that, his wife sold the property. Then let's flash forward more than 40 years. It's 1978, and the statues were found half buried in a grassy area after the DuPage County Forest Preserve acquired the property. They were converting it into a forest preserve called Hidden Lake Forest Preserve. And so then the statues were first moved to Donata Forest Preserve in Wheaton, but then the Board of Trade learned of their rediscovery through a blurb in the Forest Preserve's newsletter and asked for them back. The district agreed to donate them, and CBOT paid for them to be moved back home in 2004.
So what can you tell us about Arthur Cutton?
Okay, Arthur Cutton, he is quite a character. As a trader, he developed a reputation as a risk taker. He rode out wild swings in the market to make millions. He probably would have done really well last week in the stock market. He obviously became rich enough to build this big country home. This is a great bit of his history. In 1922, 9 men invaded his estate, robbing the Cuttons of jewels, cash, and more. The bandits locked Cutton in an airtight vault, along with his wife, his brother, a butler, and a maid, and left them there to die. But the butler saved them. The butler, John Johnson, used a small steel ruler to jimmy the lock. After they escaped, Cutton vowed to find these men, to track them down. According to the breathless newspaper accounts, he hired hundreds of private investigators. He offered cash rewards to police to track them down. 7 were apprehended within a few months, but it took 8 years to track down the ringleader.
So that's 8 men. Did he ever nab the 9th person?
We could not find any record that the 9th person had ever been found. And then Cutton himself actually later ran afoul of the law. He was the target of 2 federal investigations for market price manipulation and tax evasion. He did escape the first charge, but the tax evasion case, before the tax evasion case could be tried, he actually died of a heart attack. However, by that time, his fortune had been decimated by the Great Depression, and his estate, though, was still on the hook for this tax evasion charge, and that's why his wife ended up having to sell the property.
I see. Interesting story, as always,
Arthur
Jeffrey.
Cutton.
Thank you very much. Well, he's no corn king himself, but Jeffrey Bear is our history king. So if you have questions about Chicago history, visit our website to send them in and see more on these and other Ask Jeffrey questions.
Ask Jeffrey is made possible in part by BMO Harris Bank.
What? Oh no. I have suspicious activity on my debit card. Now what?
You know. Sorry. With BMO Harris, you can just freeze your card right from your phone.
Wow, really?
Yeah. You can unfreeze it too.
How many roommates do you have? That feeling you get when a bank puts security at your fingertips. That's the BMO effect.
And that's our show for this Wednesday night. Don't forget to stay connected with us by signing up for our daily briefing and join us tomorrow night live at 7. A leading business group's new proposal to address Illinois' fiscal health, starting at state government. And some monumental chandeliers housed in a suburban mansion will go back to their original place in Chicago. Finally tonight, Chicago lost a cultural force this past weekend with the death of Dame Libby Comaico. Comaico was the founder of Ensemble Español, a Spanish dance company based in Chicago since 1975. She was honored by the King of Spain for her efforts. Ensemble Español remains in residence at Northeastern Illinois University and still exports traditional and modern Spanish dance around the world. Dame Libby Comaico was 69 years old. We leave you with a performance by Ensemble Español recorded at WTTW in 2002. Now, for all of us here at Chicago Tonight, I'm Phil Ponce, and I thank you for watching. Good night.
Algo se muere en el alma y cuando un amigo se va. Cuando un amigo se va, algo se muere en el alma. Cuando un amigo se va, algo se muere en el alma y cuando un amigo se va. Cuando un amigo se va, iba dejando una huella que no se puede borrar. Iba dejando una huella y que no se puede borrar. No te vayas todavía, no te vayas, por favor, no te vayas todavía. Y esa es la guitarra mía, llora cuando...
Closed captioning is made possible by Robert A. Clifford and Clifford Law Offices, an accredited legal education provider and proud sponsor of the continuing legal education program for lawyers held at DePaul University College of Law on February 21st.